It's day one of Britain's first coalition government since the Second World War. The handshake that symbolises a new era. David Cameron and Nick Clegg, the double act with a plan to lead Britain for 5 years.
Today, we are not just announcing a new government and new ministers, we are announcing a new politics. A new politics where the national interest is more important than the party interest.
This is a new government, and it's a new kind of government. A radical, reforming government where it needs to be, and a source of reassurance and stability at a time of great uncertainty in our country too.
Shoulder to shoulder, the new cabinet takes shape, with Liberal Democrats serving with Conservatives at every level. The new government's plans to start cutting the deficit now gets a stamp of approval from the Bank of England. The removal vans in Downing Street, Labour's ministers head into opposition and a battle for the leadership of the party.
I'm standing for the leadership because I believe that I can lead Labour to rebuild itself as the great reforming champion of social and economic change in this country.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. We're in Downing Street. Earlier today, standing by the front door of number 10, Prime Minister David Cameron and his deputy Nick Clegg shook hands. An address that has symbolised the dominance of one party over another today stands for a partnership between two former rivals. Mr Cameron said they were ushering in a new era in which the national interest came before party politics. In a moment, we'll look at cabinet posts and the policies. But first, our political editor, Nick Robinson, reports on day one of Britain's new coalition government.
Please do not adjust your set. Normal service may not be resumed for some time. You are looking at the leader of the party which lost the election, walking up Downing Street to accept the job of Deputy Prime Minister from the man who said a hung Parliament would be a disaster for Britain. Today, David and Nick, that's how they refer to each other, said that this is what the new politics looks like. It came on a day when the new cabinet began to take shape, with Conservatives in the top jobs. George Osborne will move into number 11 as Chancellor. William Hague is our new Foreign Secretary. And what would have been a surprise on any other day, Theresa May is to be Home Secretary. But she simply can't compete with the sight of Liberals walking into government for the first time in 7 decades and shaking the hands of Conservatives as they do so. This is what Britain's new coalition cabinet will look like. The Prime Minister David Cameron, alongside his deputy Nick Clegg, and 4 other Liberal Democrats. Chris Huhne is the new Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. Danny Alexander, the new Scottish Secretary. But critically, the party gets 2 economic jobs. David Laws is the new Chief Secretary, George Osborne's deputy at the Treasury and the man who will have to negotiate those spending cuts. And Vince Cable becomes the new Business Secretary, although he's not sounding that comfortable.
Are you looking forward to working with George Osborne?
Well,
You've had your differences in the past.
we have had our differences, but I think we both realise that there's a massive task facing the country and we've got to work together on it.
In stark contrast, the new pair who will share power at Downing Street could scarcely have looked more at ease in each other's company as they strolled through the garden of number 10 together for their first joint news conference.
Today, we are not just announcing a new government and new ministers, we are announcing a new politics. A new politics where the national interest is more important than the party interest, where cooperation wins out over confrontation. I'm delighted to be standing here with the new Deputy Prime Minister, the 2 of us together leading this historic Liberal Democrat Conservative administration.
Note that phrase used again and again, a Liberal Conservative coalition, and not the other way round.
This is a new government, and it's a new kind of government. A radical, reforming government where it needs to be, and a source of reassurance and stability at a time of great uncertainty in our country too. This is a government that will last.
The new Prime Minister and his deputy used first-name terms. David and Nick completed each other's sentences. They laughed at each other's jokes.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied, Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
We're all going to have... I'm afraid I did once. Right. We're all... I'm back! We're all going to have things that we said thrown back at us.
This was not merely a love-in, it was a sort of political civil partnership ceremony, with only the colour of their ties to remind you that they lead rival parties, fielding candidates which will fight each other in a by-election in 2 weeks' time. On the morning after the night before, did you not think, I'm hooked up to someone for 5 years who I barely know and have barely spoken to? And is the country now under permanent joint leadership?
Are we going to do things together? Yes, of course, we should. This is not just two teams trying to work together. It's two teams trying to form one strong team in government. Of course, we are separate parties, and we've already talked about the Thirsk and Malton by-election. Perhaps we'll share a car to save the petrol.
Get out on opposite sides.
But of course we should do things together, because this is a joint endeavour.
The business of government set out today in a 7-page document spelling out where they agree is unlikely to be this much fun. Not since Tony Blair's first summit with President George Bush have I been to a prime ministerial news conference so cosy, so familiar, so warm. Today we saw I agree with Nick competing with I agree with David. Nick Robinson, BBC News, in the garden at Downing Street.
So Nick has talked us through some of the key cabinet positions and those held by the Liberal Democrats in David Cameron's government. But who else will be sitting around the cabinet table when they first meet? Other key jobs announced today are William Hague as Foreign Secretary and Theresa May as Home Secretary and Minister for Women and Equality. Dr. Liam Fox is named as Defence Secretary, and Ken Clarke takes on the role of Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary. Andrew Lansley assumes responsibilities for health. Michael Gove is Education Secretary. Former party leader Ian Duncan Smith becomes Work and Pension Secretary. And in the past hour, Jeremy Hunt has been named as Secretary of State for Culture, Olympics, Media and Sport. Well, during the weeks of election campaigning, the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats attacked each other on key policy areas. Now they have to work together on a joint programme. Our Deputy Political Editor, James Landale, examines the coalition compromises at the heart of the new government.
At last, the document that matters. Yes, the jokes and personal chemistry may be important in this coalition, but it's the cold, hard print on this paper, handed out in Downing Street's Rose Garden, that really matters.
So, this is it. After 5 days of negotiations, 4 pieces of paper that have allowed this coalition to be created. Effectively, a new manifesto that's going to change our lives.
A manifesto drawn up in part by these men, 2 politicians from 2 different parties, working together at the Treasury to preside over the biggest spending cuts for a generation. This is what coalition means.
This is a very vivid demonstration of the determination of our 2 parties to put party interests aside and form a government of the national interest.
I agree very much with George that if this partnership and this coalition is going to work, it has to be on the basis of a joint acceptance of the responsibilities and the very tough choices that have to be made.
So what's the government agreed to do? Well, it'll press ahead quickly with the Tories' plans for £6 billion of spending cuts this year. There'll be a referendum on limited voting reform, along with fixed-term parliaments, so no election for 5 years. A planned rise in employers' national insurance, the jobs tax, won't now happen, but employees will pay more, and there'll be a substantial increase in the tax-free personal allowance, paid for by raising some capital gains tax. But the Tories have had to put any inheritance tax cuts on hold. The Lib Dems have had to drop their amnesty for long-term illegal immigrants. Tory plans for marriage tax cuts look doubtful, as the Lib Dems won't have to back it, and they in turn have had to rule out all hopes of joining the euro for 5 years. In other words, both sides have had to compromise to get the things they really wanted.
The way you can keep the government together is not to try and do difficult things. So things I really want as a Conservative, I accept I'm not going to be able to do because we didn't win an overall majority. I think my Liberal Democrat new friends are going to have to say things they really want to do as Liberal Democrats that our changes are not going to be possible unless we also agree with them. And so let's do those things together that we all agree with, and that will be much easier.
Parliament has not seen the like of this for more than half a century. Two parties voting together. Yes, Lib Dems will be able to abstain on some tricky issues, but for the most part, they and their Tory counterparts will together give the coalition a majority in the House of Lords and the House of Commons. So, what are the numbers? Well, the Tories will make up the bulk of the government benches with 306 MPs. Alongside them, there'll be 57 Lib Dems. On the other side of the floor will sit Labour's 258 MPs, and the other parties 28 MPs in all, giving the coalition a comfortable working majority of 82.
Nick Clegg!
Oh yes, and Nick Clegg won't stand here anymore. He'll be at the dispatch box, sometimes even answering Prime Minister's questions if Mr Cameron's away. So the new double act of British politics have the relationship, manifesto and numbers that could make this coalition work, as long as their parties and opponents let them. James Landell, BBC News, Westminster.
And of course you can get more detail about the policies of the coalition on the BBC News website. That's at bbc.co.uk/news. Well, Nick Robinson's here. Let's get his judgment on day one. Watching those pictures of the two men together, it was a bit like a wedding there in the Rose Garden. What did we learn from the body language, do you think?
It was just quite extraordinary. I mean, journalists were really lost for words when we saw that display of affection, of agreement, of consensus that there was. In the matter of a week, we've gone from I disagree with Nick to I agree with Nick on about everything, and he pretty much agrees with me. The reason they have to put on that display is it will be the glue at the heart of this relationship, the like of which we have not seen in British politics for 7 decades, when the going gets tough, and it will get tough, between ministers of rival parties, between the parties themselves, between backbenchers and the government. They need that glue. But I'm told it began on the day after the general election, when both men woke up and said, this simply isn't going to work, this hung parliament, unless we are in coalition. They had a meeting, they got on, they seemed to share the same ideas, and they thought, you know what, let's just do it.
You know, Nick, earlier on I read out a list of cabinet names and posts. What do you make of the sharing out of power in that way?
Well, it's interesting because what you notice is what's important to the Conservatives in this coalition and what is important to the Liberal Democrats. The Conservative red lines, if you like, in the negotiations were protecting their positions on deficit, therefore spending cuts. George Osborne does that, but he makes sure rather cleverly that Liberal Democrats will share the pain with him. It will actually be a man called David Laws who will have to identify where the cuts fall. Rather useful if you're the Conservatives. Their other red lines were foreign affairs in Europe, so they have William Hague as Foreign Secretary, and immigration too, so Theresa May as Home Secretary. And then the Liberal Democrats get business, to charm the business world, to use, if you like, hope some of the gloss of Vince Cable rubs off on this government. And then, of course, the Liberal Democrats, one of their favourite policy areas, the environment too, for Chris Huhne. The question is, will all the parts add up to more than the sum of the whole? Will it all cohere? And we frankly won't know that, George, for some days to come.
All right, Nick, we'll talk a little later, but thank you for now. Thank you. Well, both Mr Cameron and Mr Clegg say they want to get straight down to dealing with Britain's economic crisis. As we've heard, the Conservative pledge to start cutting the massive deficit this year still stands. And today it received backing from the Governor of the Bank of England. Dealing with the economy will be a key test for the new government, as our economics editor Stephanie Flanders reports.
Britain's last coalition government had to win World War II. This one has to clean up the mess created by the worst financial crisis since the Depression. Reducing the enormous budget deficit is job one. And today, their plan got endorsement from a crucial and surprising source. At his quarterly press conferences, the Governor of the Bank of England usually refuses to comment on the details of government policy. Not today.
I am very pleased that there is a very clear and binding commitment to accelerate the reduction in the deficit over the lifetime of the Parliament and to introduce additional measures this fiscal year to demonstrate the importance of getting to grips with that before running the risk of an adverse market reaction.
During the campaign, both Labour and the Liberal Democrats had said that extra spending cuts this year would put the economic recovery at risk. But in effect, Mervyn King today sided with the Conservatives. He said that spending cuts wouldn't derail the recovery in his view, and he thought the Greek crisis had shown the risks of not acting were even greater than we thought.
It's going to be a very difficult environment with which to operate, but, you know, I went into politics to do things. We now have an opportunity to do that, to deliver on behalf of the country and also our own party's commitments.
To make a deal, the Tories have agreed to raise the income tax threshold dramatically starting next year. They'll pay for it by watering down their promise to cut national insurance and by raising capital gains tax, another idea the Tories previously opposed. But even a coalition government can't legislate for a strong recovery. The pace of Britain's economic recovery over the next few years is going to have a huge impact on whether this government can deliver. But as George Osborne knows well, our economic growth is not something he can directly control.
There is a risk that consumers may not be able to increase how much they spend over the coming years because incomes might be very weak, and also the level of debt is extremely high, so people need to save a lot more than they used to.
If the government and households are tightening their belts, our recovery depends crucially on other countries growing faster and buying our goods. The crisis in the Eurozone means that's far from guaranteed.
We will need to see a slowing of domestic demand and an expansion of net exports. That's the rebalancing the UK economy requires in the next few years. That is not something that we can guarantee ourselves. We need to have a prosperous world economy, and in particular a prosperous European economy, for us to be able to do it.
Today, the financial markets were lukewarm in their reaction to the new government. On the budget, there's been a surprising amount of give and take. But the biggest spanner in the works could yet be the state of the global economy. Stephanie Flanders, BBC News.
One key policy the Liberal Democrats bring to the table is banking reform. Let's go to our business editor, Robert Peston, who's in the city tonight. Obviously, Robert, the banks at the centre of the economic crisis, should they fear or welcome this new government, do you think?
Well, we've just heard from Stephanie that the bloke who works in that building behind me, the Bank of England, Mervyn King, said some very positive things about the deficit reduction programme of the new government. Most bankers and indeed investors would agree with Mervyn King that that would be good for the economy, good for their businesses. However, we've also got some very strong words in this agreement between the two parties on cleaning up the banking system, making it safe. They've talked about banning unacceptable bonuses. Very strong words on the imposition of a new bank tax. And for me, what's particularly interesting is a commitment to set up an independent commission to look at breaking up big banks like Royal Bank of Scotland and Barclays to separate their so-called speculative investment banking activities. So a bit of good and a bit of bad for bankers. The other thing that the City will be looking at very closely is that crucial relationship between the new Chancellor, George Osborne, and the new Business Secretary, Vince Cable. In opposition, they got on spectacularly badly. They've now got to get on as colleagues around the cabinet table. There'll be a huge amount of interest about whether or not former enemies can become friends.
All right, Robert, thank you very much. Well, after 13 years in government, the Labour Party now has to get used to opposition. The grand offices and the ministerial cars are gone. On top of that, the party has to find a new leader. This afternoon, the former Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, announced he will stand as a candidate. Our political correspondent, Rita Chakrabarti, reports.
Gordon Brown was keeping out of the way at his constituency home in Scotland today. With his departure barely a day old, the starting gun was fired on the Labour leadership race, with supporters of the first man out of the blocks endorsing him before he'd even declared.
I'll be supporting David Miliband.
I'm supporting David.
I will back David Miliband.
A few hours later, the man himself emerged, surrounded by his supporters, to make his pitch.
I'm standing for the leadership because I believe that I can lead Labour to rebuild itself as the great reforming champion of social and economic change in this country.
David Miliband was not just first to declare, he's thought to be the front runner. Aged 44, he was until yesterday Foreign Secretary and is a former advisor to Tony Blair. The race could be a family affair if his younger brother Ed decides to run. He's 40, a former cabinet minister and used to be advisor to Gordon Brown. Other runners are expected to be Ed Balls, who's close to Gordon Brown, Andy Burnham, who was Health Secretary, and John Cruddas, an influential left-wing backbencher.
When I say go, 1, 2, 3, we...
The traditional new MP's photo has many fewer Labour people now. This afternoon, their acting leader, Harriet Harman, said they'd be an effective and powerful opposition, but their future will be determined by who they choose as leader.
Labour MPs will get another chance to discuss the party's direction at a post-election debate this evening. This is Labour's first full leadership contest for 16 years, a chance for the party to regroup and perhaps renew. Rita Chakrabarti, BBC News, Westminster.
Our top story tonight. David Cameron and Nick Clegg pledged to put the national interest above party politics in the new coalition government. And coming up, shoulder to shoulder or still toe to toe, can parties' grassroots campaigners work together? We're in Bristol to find out.
And in 15 minutes, Reporting Scotland comes live from Westminster. Plus, a look at new figures showing unemployment in Scotland's up by a third over the last year. And we hear from the managers of both teams ahead of the Scottish Cup final.
Well, David Cameron has been taking phone calls from leaders around the world, and one of those, of course, was from Barack Obama. Today, the US president had this to say about the new British Prime Minister.
He's somebody who I had the occasion of meeting when I had traveled to England previously. I find him to be a smart, dedicated, effective leader, and somebody who we are going to be able to work with very effectively.
Well, let's go live now to our North America editor, Mark Mardell, who's in Washington. Well, Mark, those were very, very complimentary comments, weren't they?
Indeed. The two men did meet when they were both simply candidates. They met in London, and I'm told that there is really a strong personal chemistry established between them. But I think more than that, there is a bit of politics here. The White House has been stung and irritated by suggestions that the special relationship under this administration isn't what it used to be, and that indeed President Obama had snubbed Gordon Brown on a few occasions. So they're going to start this one making sure there's no ambiguity and that they get off on the right foot.
Well, did the president say anything about some of the more challenging issues, Afghanistan, for example?
Yes, he did. He said in that phone call last night he was very pleased that Mr Cameron raised Afghanistan himself without him raising it, and said that he was committed to the strategy. There's a strong feeling here that there'll be continuity on all the big international questions, that there won't be any change or break. And an example of how important this government sees the relationship with America, William Hague is coming out just about as soon as he can. The new Foreign Secretary is coming out on Friday to meet Hillary Clinton.
All right, Mark, thank you very much. Well, David Cameron has promised to travel around the UK as soon as possible. Neither the Conservatives nor the Liberal Democrats is part of the devolved government in Scotland or Wales. So how will relations between them and Westminster work? Let's talk to our political editors in Scotland and Wales, Brian Taylor and Betsan Powers. First to Brian in Edinburgh. Brian, what's the reaction there?
Well, there's a political dimension here. For the Labour Party and the SNP were already gearing up to question the mandate of the Conservatives to govern Scotland with just one MP. Now they're questioning whether the Liberal Democrats have imposed upon Scotland a Conservative administration, a UK government that apparently the Scots didn't vote for. But there's an intergovernmental dimension too. Alex Salmond, as you say, will meet David Cameron next week. He's gearing up to question the Liberal Conservative administration on the business of spending cuts and the impact upon Scotland. There will be criticism, there will be confrontation, there will be mutual suspicion. But my guess is there will also be cooperation. The economic crisis, after all, demands nothing less. Let's cross now to Cardiff and my colleague, Betsan Powers.
Thanks, Brian. Well, bear in mind here in Wales, you're now talking about the relationship between two coalition governments. There is already a partnership at work here in Cardiff Bay, a pretty unlikely cobbled together one, as it was called a few years ago, between Labour and Plaid Cymru, and the two parties in opposition here in Wales and now in government in Westminster. So Labour and Plaid Cymru dictate how Welsh schools and hospitals are run, but it's the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats who dictate the size of the Welsh budget, to what extent cuts will be inflicted here in Wales. Now, the Welsh First Minister, Carwyn Jones, he simply said he's looking forward to a business-like relationship, a constructive relationship with David Cameron and Nick Clegg, and there will be an early test for that relationship. Will this new coalition UK government steer through Parliament? One of the key objectives of this government here. a referendum which could grant more powers to this assembly.
Bets and Powers, Brian Taylor, thank you both. So here in Westminster, the partnership between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats is being cemented. But what's happening in places where just a week ago the parties were fighting each other for votes? John Kay has been talking to grassroots activists and supporters in the Liberal Democrat stronghold of Bristol West.
Two men, Nick Clegg and David Cameron.
However many screens you watched it on, it was still hard to take in. In this TV showroom, the audience was divided.
You honestly believe it'll work? I do, really, yeah. Yes. I hope you're right for the country's sake.
From the wealthy terraces of Clifton to multiracial St Paul's, Bristol West elected a Lib Dem MP last week, but few expected him to join with the Tories.
Young people who voted Lib Dem for the first time to keep the Tories out will feel betrayed.
It seems like the Liberal Democrats are just going to give up all of their policies so that they can have some good jobs.
The Liberal Democrats have a very mixed power base. In their large rural constituencies, people seem to be far more up for the idea of working with the Conservatives. But in urban seats like Bristol here, there seems to be much more hostility towards David Cameron and the Tories.
There's a large Lib Dem student vote here, and activists like Chris are pessimistic about the coalition.
Won't last.
Really?
No.
Why not?
I don't think that Clegg can... He won't have the power he needs to address the core Lib Dem issues.
But others in the party are more positive about this historic union. In the past, the Lib Dems and Tories have cooperated in the council here, and we found plenty of voters who'd like to see the same at national level.
There are good and bad points in both the manifestos, and there will be a middle road.
I think it's a great idea that people share power.
Suddenly, everything looks very different, and it's not just the politicians who are getting used to it. John Kay, BBC News, Bristol.
Well, for a final thought, with me again is our political editor, Nick Robinson. Now, we know Nick Clegg is the Deputy Prime Minister, but do we know what that entails, Nick?
Well, we know one thing already. We've just seen the Chief of the Defence Staff go in, we've just seen the new Home Secretary go into Downing Street for the first meeting of a National Security Council. So Nick Clegg will sit in the sort of meetings you'd expect Prime Ministers to sit in. We're just seeing now Liam Fox, the new Defence Secretary, come in too. So these people will be talking, Nick Clegg will be there, about defence, about terrorism and so on. But the big thing I don't think we've quite clocked onto yet is that Nick Clegg has a massive package of political reform, the sort of political reform Liberals have always favoured, the Conservatives always resisted, which I think he's going to try and push through this new coalition government. Not just a referendum on changing the voting system, not just changes to the way the House of Commons works, but also an elected House of Lords as well. Now, there's no guarantee of legislation, but my sense is that that's the big prize that he thinks he's got in this new government.
Good. Nick, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Well, it's time now to get the weather with Helen Willett. It was spotting with rain earlier on, Helen, but it's looking a bit better now.
George, at least it's not snowing on you. This was a recent shot from Aberdeen, or an earlier shot with some snow on the tulips and rhubarb. It's May, and yes, it will once again become clear and frosty overnight. But before then, actually a warning, because those showers actually further west across southeast Wales and Devon are quite hard, giving some quite significant rain at the moment. But after dark, they'll soon fade away. It becomes dry and clear, except across Northern Ireland and Scotland. Not as cold here because we introduced more cloud, but for the bulk of the UK, another very frosty night out in the sticks. Even the towns and cities will be within a degree or so of freezing. Well, it should be 7 or 8 degrees at this time of year, so a damaging frost for those delicate flowers. Really quite disappointing. Now, after that cold start again Friday, temperatures rise rapidly, 13 to 15, but again we've got those slow-moving showers across central areas in particular. And that showery picture continues into the weekend, hopefully more sunshine than showers, but still chilly. We might get 16 or 17 if we're lucky in the capital, which is a little below par for this time of year, isn't it, George? Back to you.
Helen, thank you very much. So it's been an historic day here in Downing Street. Britain has its first coalition government since the Second World War. There's continuing coverage of all the latest political moves and all the drama at Westminster throughout the evening on the BBC's News Channel. But now on BBC One, it's time to join our news teams where you are. Goodbye.